Senator Keith Alvo, what have you learned so far in your investigation on the subject of comic books?
I was amazed to find the number of comic books being published each month in the United States. We found about 100 million. Of these 100 million going out, approximately 80 million are all right. They're funny, entertaining. Some of them are educational. But about 20 million were of the horror and crime type.
Well, what about the effect of these comic books on the children?
All of our testimony from psychiatrists and children themselves show that it's very upsetting, that it has a bad moral effect, and that it is directly responsible for a substantial amount of juvenile delinquency and child crime.
Discover the Horror Podcast.
Comic books are said to have started out around 1933 with humor and adventure strips. In 1936, the first single-genre comics appeared featuring detective stories. In 1938 came the superheroes, and by 1942, true crime entered comic stories. By this time, there were hundreds of titles being published by dozens of publishers on a multitude of genres. While some of these comics did publish what we would consider horror stories, it wasn't until 1947 that what is considered the first all-horror comic book was published by Avon Comics, simply titled Eerie Comics No. 1. And there was no number 2. By 1948, Adventures into the Unknown No. 1 became the first successful horror comic series. By 1949, Pre-Marvel Comics, then known as Atlas, entered the horror comic world with Amazing Mysteries No. 32, and in 1950, EC Comics entered the horror game with Haunt of Fear, Vault of Horror, and Crypt of Terror, later changed to Tales from the Crypt. Overall, from the late 40s to the early 50s, there were over 1,400 pre-code horror comics published by over 30 publishers, with titles like Skeleton Hand, Black Cat Mystery, Beware, Horrific, Mr. Mystery, Adventures into Darkness, and many more. But what do we mean when we say pre-code horror? Throughout the birth of comics and leading up to the early 50s, comic books were an unregulated industry, meaning they ultimately had no guidelines they needed to follow as far as content. And for horror comics, this meant dismemberment, decapitations, being buried alive, cannibalism, and a whole slew of monsters and creepy crawlies that would slither their way out of the grave and onto the comics page. But in 1954, that would all change. Written by Dr. Frederick Wortham, his book Seduction of the Innocent claimed horror, crime, romance, and other comic genres contributed to juvenile delinquency and violent behavior. And this was all it took for the conservatives to go off and running. A Senate committee was created and the Comics Code was established. Unlike the PMRC, which had just put warning labels on music, the Comics Code Authority was much more harsh. Scenes of excessive violence shall be prohibited. Scenes of brutal torture, excessive and unnecessary knife and gunplay, physical agony, gory and gruesome crime shall be eliminated. No comic magazine shall use the word horror or terror in its title. All scenes of horror, excessive bloodshed, gory or gruesome crimes, depravity, lust, sadism, masochism shall not be permitted. All lurid, unsavory, gruesome illustrations shall be eliminated. Inclusion of stories dealing with evil shall be used or shall be published only when the intent is to illustrate a moral issue, and in no case shall evil be presented alluringly, nor as to injure the sensibilities of the reader. Scenes dealing with or instruments associated with Walking Dead, torture, vampires and vampirism, ghouls, cannibalism, and werewolfism are prohibited. These new set of rules practically made it impossible for the horror comics we loved to survive and thrive. The titles that didn't immediately fold moved over to fantasy and science fiction tales. By the time the 60s came, superheroes ruled the comic shelves, and our long now defunct horror comic books had to wait for the 1970s before they figured out a loophole in the Comics Code and printed horror comics not in the standard comic size format, but in magazine size with glorious black and white art. But that is a tale for another time. Welcome to Discover the Horror. Our goal is to give you reasons to explore horror you've never seen and give you new ways to see horror you've loved for years. I'm Damian Glonick, co-creator of Living Dead Dolls.
John Kitley, staff writer for Horror Hound Magazine, and I run Kitley's Crypt.
I'm Aaron Abishan. I teach film production and film studies at a university and write about horror just about anywhere I can. And tonight we have a very special guest, a real expert on the subject. Professor Dan Yezbick is with us. Now, Dan teaches English and media communications at St. Louis Community College, Wildwood, and also teaches, appropriately, a course called Ghoulish Graphics, Horror Comics at Webster University in St. Louis. Dan's written extensively on comics, including having contributed all the general horror comics entries for the Encyclopedia Comics Through Time, and he's also a founding member of the Comic Studies Society. And it's worth pointing out that I've known Dan. Dan, I guess I've known you for 7 or 8, 9 years, something like that. Yeah. And the way I met Dan was at a convention. I happened to go into a panel about comics, and he was the resident expert on horror comics. So it feels very appropriate to have invited Dan on to talk about this subject. So Dan, welcome.
Thank you. I feel wonderful being here. I'm very grateful.
We also feel wonderful being here, and it's great to have you.
Yeah.
So I think that the pre-code is a really important thing, primarily because it feels like a footnote. It feels like a thing that people know kind of about. If they know anything about it, they know some of the facts about the banning of these comics. They know that the comics were banned, and if they know much at all, they know about EC Comics, and we can talk all about that. But let's start, if you don't mind, with the question, why should anybody care about comic books that were published when our grandparents were teenagers?
That's a fantastic question, and I actually asked that very question to the class in Ghoulish Graphics, and I should probably share a couple of their answers later on if we have a chance. First of all, as I'm sure many of us will probably agree, unlike the 21st century, the 20th century was largely consumed with comic books and magazines and newspapers and all kinds of print, visual print periodicals that we just don't have anymore. Popular culture doesn't revolve that way anymore. It tends to work more digitally. It tends to work more with streaming. So comics, not just horror comics, but comics in general, were an incredibly significant part of juvenile American culture, of all ages American leisure culture. A lot of people, when they were tired from work or when they were tired from their military service, what do? They sat down. They might not have time to read a novel or a short story or watch TV, but they might actually pick up an Archie comic or an Uncle Scrooge comic or a Superman or a Batman or a horror comic and read that. So one of the things we need to remember is just how ubiquitous and how substantial comic strips, comic books, comics culture was in America in the 20th century. And it's much more legitimized now, which is very, very funny. We don't have the million issue print runs that we used to have with some of the comics that exist, but I think more people are reading comics in more places in more ways than ever before. It's just not that go to the drugstore, go to the bus station, go to the newsstand, and buy 10 comics for in the 30s, 10 comics for $1. In the 40s and 50s, slightly fewer, but still. So part of it is just what I call cultural archaeology, going back and remembering how every kid in America had a stack of comics somewhere, right? And sometimes that stack of comics was shared with siblings or shared with parents, even grandparents. Sometimes that stack was hidden in the bedroom, especially if it was the horror comics, because they were considered taboo. They were marked as inappropriate. And sometimes there's a lot of people who still tell me that their favorite memory growing up was reading the Sunday comics with their grandparents. They would read it together and they would kind of laugh together. And we don't, I'm not saying it's bad that we don't have that anymore, but we do not have that anymore. And I think it's very important to kind of remember how that worked. The second thing is that horror comics in general, especially the pre-code comics, which run from about 1950 to about 1954, 55, depending on how you want to date them, did something that no other public medium had done before. And they did it so extremely and so shockingly and so unequivocally without worry, or in some people would say without responsibility, that we've never really had anything quite like it before. Maybe the moral guardians worrying about rock and roll and rap lyrics and horror movies and video games are there, but when you even though you can get them much more easily than you could before, you have to make a conscious choice to watch a movie. You have to make a conscious choice to listen to a song or buy an album, right? The way horror comics worked is they sort of stayed there, and it was often the first purchase kids made or the first purchase that young adults made, and they could read them again and again and again and again. It wasn't the same as listening to a song or watching a film, something like that. So for the first time, really, aside from like the uh, penny dreadfuls in Europe in the 19th century shock magazines in the U.S., you had these horror stories that could be sustained, that were visual and written. They were multimodal, and they were incredibly gruesome and shocking and bitter and angry and full of, as we said before, full of a kind of sadism that we just didn't have in popular culture in a sustainable, repeating way. And there's lots of questions as to why. And why these things were as vibrant and as extreme and as brutally sadistic and gruesome as they were. And we can talk about some of those questions later. But there's never been anything quite like it before. Certainly not before. There hasn't been anything quite like it since. So much so that, as your excellent introduction said, right, the government took notice. Estes Kefauver had a committee to find out. There were theories even before Wortham. There were theories that these horror comics and these crime comics were part of a Soviet conspiracy to melt the brains of American children, to destroy our ethos, to do all kinds of terrible things to kids. Catholic Church had been crusading against horror comics for a long time. Wortham's stuff brought it into the mainstream. His book was a popular Book of the Month Club selection. It made him into kind of a noted social figure, which then led to all kinds of other concerns with the banning of the horror comics or the creation of the code, and really, unfortunately, not only the closing of a lot of publishers, but a lot of really interesting creative people lost their jobs, and it really did almost destroy the entire industry because it got so blown out of control. There's excellent research, excellent histories on all of that. But the big question there is why? Why the horror comics? They had, pinup magazines. There were gruesomely written pulps. There were hard-boiled detective stories that no one sent. No one created a government committee to try to shut those down. So what was it about the comics? And I asked another comic scholar recently, and I said, what was it about EC and Avon and Harvey and St. John that got everyone so worked up? And he said, sometimes, responsible or not, the content is just so damn good that a culture can't stand it, that it's so right. It's that it's chomping right on the edge of the jugular vein that makes that culture work. And at their best, and there were plenty of horrible ones, at their best, the horror comics were really criticizing this post-war sense of Cold War paranoia, the post-war gender hegemony of its time, that we had to have man's men and women's women, and this sort of Leave It to Beaver culture that was taking over mainstream thinking. And they were also one of my theories is that a lot of these creators served in World War II, and they didn't really have the appropriate medical facilities to help them with their PTSD, to deal with the trauma that they experienced. So they kind of transposed a lot of the visual shock, violence, gore, and horror that they experienced on the battlefield into these comics, which is not unlike what the German Expressionists did when they came out of World War I. It's exactly the same kind of process. And surprise, surprise, the German Expressionists were equally vilified and criticized as, misfits, freaks, dangerous, subversives, that kind of thing. So that's a big, long answer to a simple question. I apologize.
It seems like a good opportunity, though, to jump in and kind of something you said a minute ago. I was going to ring in on, which is, I think that for the last 40 years or so, I have, even yet as a very, very full grown adult who is at least old enough to be, certainly a parent and probably a grandparent, I still love the notion of things that are bad for kids.
Mhm.
You
Oh,
know,
yeah.
I
Yeah,
still
yeah, yeah.
search out things that somebody tells me is bad for kids.
Right.
You know, this is going to ruin the children's minds or moral, you know, blah, 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 whatever. And I still love anything that they tell me is going to do that. So I'm curious if we maybe could go around and talk about, first of all, how did we all find horror comics the first time? Like, how did, you know, I know, John, you're not a big reader of them or anything, but I'm sure we've all at least experienced them. And maybe it would help everybody get us out there who's listening, get a sense of what our own backgrounds are with these things.
I'll go first because mine's going to be a short answer. I didn't read a lot in my younger days. Even when I collected superhero comics, very seldomly did I actually read them.
Mhm.
It's just not something that I did.
Mhm.
But I did have copies of Eerie and I
Creepy.
think maybe a couple of Creepy.
Yeah.
Um, I didn't get into the Tales from the Crypt stuff until well after, I think when they were reissuing those in the
Mhm.
90s.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I had already known the movies, the
Mhm.
Amicus stuff. But I will say the thing that I find puzzling, I don't really because I know how society works, but the Tales from the Crypt or the EC comics, those were morality plays. They had stories, they had, you know, there was reasoning behind the stories. If you do something bad, bad stuff's going to happen to you.
Mhm.
Granted, they were very sick and twisted morality plays, but they were still a moral code in there.
Mhm.
And I don't think the audiences, whether the parents or the Senate, they didn't want to see that. And to me, I just think it's a damn shame because you could have been teaching kids back then that the difference between right and wrong, or you'll be a zombie.
Yeah, yeah. We'll get into that because there's definitely a lot of conversation about how these are punishment stories and revenge stories, but it's a mixed bag when you go deeply because there's some that are straight up, you know, if you're a jerk, we're going to cut your head off and stick it on a
Mhm.
post.
Mhm.
But the other ones are just like, hey, if you like to eat too many donuts, you deserve to die.
Mhm.
You know, Damien.
You know, I read comics as a kid, but I never was super into them, and I never really collected them. It wasn't until I got to be about 16, 17-year old. I had some friends that collected comics, and they would go to the comic book store, and I would just kind of go with them, and I would look around, and I'm like, oh, comic books, interesting. So I would start picking up titles here and there. Of course, I was, full fledged into horror, so I was just sticking with horror comics then, and independents, black and whites, and stuff like that. And then I eventually got bit by the superhero bug, and then was pretty much just buying every comic book on the shelf, and which of course led me to buying all the EC reprints that Russ Cochran was putting out at the time,
Mhm.
and really reading those. I think what gravitated me towards it so much was the artwork in the EC comics was
Mhm.
phenomenal. There were
Mhm.
so many good artists doing work in there, and the stories were all really good too. And because I was buying like pretty much every horror comic that came out at the time in the 90s, I
Mhm.
started picking up a comic book called Tales Too Terrible to Tell.
Mhm.
And all it did was reprint pre-code horror comics that were not EC.
Mhm.
And those early pre-code horror comics, I think what mostly attracted me was that the covers were phenomenal.
Mhm.
Such great cover art. And the interiors were, some are good, mostly not.
Mhm.
It's a lot like the 60s or 70s movie posters, where the posters were like
Mhm.
phenomenal movie
Right.
posters,
The movies.
and you
Yeah.
watch the movie and you're like, that wasn't in that movie.
Right. Right.
Those pre-code comics were a lot like that. But I eventually got so into comics, I went to the School of Visual Arts in New York
Mhm.
and majored in comic book and
Mhm.
illustrations. And one of my teachers at the school was Joe Orlando, who did work for EC Comics and a lot
Mhm.
of other stuff. And I was just like, I would be in class, and his class would just kind of like, do whatever you want, draw comics, and then just show me what you're doing. And I was all my art was heavily influenced, and my storytelling was always heavily influenced by EC Comics and the way they had that morality tale and stuff. So I would bring artwork up to him, and he would put a piece of tracing paper over it, and he'd be like, do something like this. And I'd be like, I have a Joe Orlando sketch. You know, keep it,
Right,
put it in my
right,
portfolio.
right, right.
It was great, but
That's great.
yeah, I mean, again, I love horror of all types, and I've always collected horror comics for, I probably stopped heavily buying comics about 15, almost 20 years ago, but for a good 15, 20-year run, I was buying comics every week. And it was, and, another funny story is, I was at a Comic Con. I think it was like a Wizard World in Chicago one time, and it was a heavy Comic Con. Star Wars, Transformers, GI Joe, that type of shit. And I was never really into any of that, and there wasn't a lot of horror
Right.
around at Comic Cons, and it probably still isn't. So I was with some coworkers. We had like a booth there for Mezco Toys, and they were like run out, and they were like, "Oh, look at this Star Wars thing I got!" And they'd come back, and they're buying all this shit, and I'm like feeling left out, right? Like, man, I want to buy something. There's nothing here for me. I'm like, I'm going to go out. I'm going to wander around. I'm going to find something I want. And I started looking at all these pre-code horror comics that people were selling. I'm like, they were pretty pricey, $150 for issues and stuff. I was like, well, this is kind of cool. Maybe I'll start like buying pre-code horror comics. And I'm like, what the fuck am I thinking? Like, I can't start a whole new collection on stuff that's like minimum $100 an issue. So I quickly put that one to bed and never wound up buying any original pre-code horror comics.
A wise strategy, a wise choice.
Dan, how did you first encounter horror comics?
So if I can tell two brief stories. So I started like you. I was not a big reader when I was young. I just wasn't. It just wasn't something that I could do. It took me a long time to find my way to reading, and when I did, I didn't stop. But I always had comics because you don't need to read them in the conventional, traditional, left to right literacy sense, because they're multimodal. Like the colors and the shapes and the forms and the compositions and the covers, the beautiful, wonderful, dynamic covers, they just leap out at you, and you can entertain yourself without reading through full stories. It's a very, very fresh and original way of encountering art and narrative, and that's what excited me, I think. But when I was, I guess I was in like 4th or 5th grade, my parents took the standard American trip out west in the Starcraft van and everything. We went and saw the national parks, and that was great. We loved it. But when you're in 4th grade, the national parks, one butte starts to look like another butte, one rock formation starts to look like another one. And I lived for the gas station stops because I could get Coke and I could get Whitman 3-packs of comics, and I could read those in the car while we were going past butte number 452. And those Whitman comics had reprints of 1950s, not horror stories, but Carl Barks stories, Disney stories, Uncle Scrooge and Donald Duck. And, you'd think that would be really, really light and lively and fun and family friendly. But Carl Barks is one of the darkest satirists in the history of comics. And I still remember reading a couple stories and actually having nightmares because of the terrible things that happen to people who are greedy, people who are status oriented, who are sort of egomaniacs, people who treat other people badly. He punished these people in horrific ways. And just to let you know, when I taught the class at Webster, we read a Carl Barks Donald Duck story called The Golden Helmet. And one kid came in after he read it, and he said, "That is the single darkest story I have ever read in my entire life." He says Donald Duck turns evil.
Yay.
I mean, and it was Barks's reaction to the Lord of the Rings. He basically put the Ring of Power in the sort of Disney Duckverse and watched everyone get tainted and tempted. And it's a brutal story, but it's terrifying. So I came to horror comics through a very different kind of comic. But the first horror comic that really grabbed me was I probably was about 12 years old, and in the EC tradition, once the code sort of lightened a bit, we had House of Mystery and House of Secrets and Chamber of Chills from Marvel and Tower of Shadows and things like that. And I saw this cover of House of Mystery with like a heavy metal rock concert on the cover, and this personification of death electrocuting the lead singer. And it was absolutely the most terrifying thing I had ever seen in public in my life, and I was absolutely fascinated from there on. I'm like, how does this happen? How does this come to me? How do I protect myself from this? I was absolutely fascinated in all of the wrong ways, just like I'm sure many of you guys have been with horror movies and horror art and horror stories and posters. And I said, it just like we said before, why did everyone come down on the pre-code stories? Because they were just too damn good. They were too rich, too powerful, too strong. I still remember that moment like it happened 5 minutes ago. And I was like, whatever this is, this ignited everything that I like about being afraid, and I want to have more of it. I'm going to keep chasing this dragon as long as I can. So,
Hey, if you could, before we go any further, let's not forget, for those of you listening out there, those of you watching on YouTube, whatever it is, if you could do us a favor, if you like the show, if you could subscribe to the show, it would do us a huge favor. If you could leave a review, if you could leave a comment on YouTube, it really, really helps us out. And it helps you out, I hope, because it gets you more of this stuff, and it'll make sure that you get every episode that we do. So please like, subscribe, and comment.
I do remember some eerie issues where I don't remember the stories, but I remember single frames.
yeah.
Like to your point, Dan, there because it was black and white and there wasn't it was
Right.
almost more dark and shadows than detail. It really screws with your mind because it's not telling you exactly like I think there was a box with body parts in it, if I can remember correctly. But it was so dark, you knew something was in there like a hand,
Yeah,
but it was so encased in shadows that you couldn't exactly tell. And it's almost like the old movies where they show you part of the creature but not the whole
that's
thing,
right.
and your brain does the rest, and you're going, fuck, I don't want to look in that box.
Yeah, comics, as many theorists have said, comics is very much based on closure. If you read a comic strip, you put the panels together, going through the gutter, each from frame to frame to frame, and you're telling the story to yourself, cognitively, semantically making sense of each image. So you see people move or run or jump or whatever, and you're absolutely right. There might not be a more suggestive art form than comics, because once you get that big moment, that big payoff, that sort of semi reveal, then you have that in your head and your brain is processing that in all kinds of crazy ways. There's a million theories as to how that works, and that's a whole nother thing. But I think for horror comics, especially for those in the EC tradition, where you had single issues that were always anthologies, and there were always 4 or 5 stories, and they were all one and done stories, except for the MCs, the Crypt Keeper, the Old Witch. Right? They're the only people who ever came back. And every story had this, what the EC creators, what Joe Orlando called the springboard ending, right? The flip ending, the twist ending, but more than a twist. It always had to have a kind of a gruesome visual and prose joke at the end. You had to have lots of puns. When you get to those last panels, and of course Eerie and Creepy are working with the same formula, right? That you get those last moments that they're just like nails in your psyche,
Yeah.
and you can't get them out. There are stories like that. I don't remember what the hell happens in the story, but I sure remember that ending, right? For that very reason.
Yeah, for me, the genesis of it, and my story is very different than your guys, because at least John and Dan, because I was a even more voracious reader as a kid than I am now, considerably more voracious. Like I've slowed down a bit, but I loved to read, and consequently, I didn't like to read comic books because I read so much so fast that a comic book lasted for like 10 minutes, and then I was like, and I had really bad attention problems. And so the idea of I'd burn through an issue of a comic in 10 minutes, and then I wouldn't get to know what it said, what happened next for a month, was impossible for me. I'll never forget them bringing me comic books whenever I was when I had chicken pox. And I'll never forget that Casper the Ghost comic book that they bought for me, and I was just like, what the hell happens next? I was just beside myself. Because I was like hallucinating sick too. But then and we'll do a Warren episode down the line a little bit, and we can talk more about the Warren stuff because it's really important to me. But my grandma worked in a drugstore, and she brought me home Warren comics. She knew I loved horror. I didn't have much of an outlet for it, and she brought me home Creepy and Eerie that was just in the news on the newsstand in the very, very early 80s, and that turned me on to that. And then when I was 11, we went to Europe, and I was so stupid that I didn't think to pack anything to read. And my dad likes to do everything the hard way. So we drove 11 hours through France at one point. And like you were saying, Dan, doesn't matter if it's a butte or a chateau.
Mhm.
After a while, 847 chateaus in,
Mhm.
you're like, I've seen all the chateaus I need.
Right.
But I had bought a comic book at the airport, and I read that 847 times. I just kept cycling back through it, so it developed an interest in them. And then fast forward like another year or so, I made friends with this guy named Mark Rausch. He's a filmmaker now. Mark, if you're listening, here's your shout out. And he just made a short film. In fact, I kickstarted it for him. But I went over to his house, and his whole family was into comic books. His older brother was into comics. His dad was into comics. They shopped at the same, what was the original location of the same comic store I came and met you in, Dan, today.
Right.
Most comic, early 80s. And he had just 1,000 million comics, and I was telling him, well, I don't really like this stuff. I only like the creepy and eerie stuff. And I learned the reason I could read creepy and eerie, as you might imagine from my Genesis tale, is that they're anthology stories, right? The whole stories they start and end in every issue. It's one of the things that I love about horror comics to this day, is that they're usually in that format. So he starts pulling out all this stuff, and he's like, I don't even really like horror comics. And he starts selling them to me for like 50 cents an issue. And they were Chamber of Chills reprints of old pre-code horror comics, Dead of Night, all that stuff that was out in the 70s, which at this point was about 10 years old, so it was stuff like happens with comics, stuff that's 10 years old, probably isn't worth anything. And then 10 more years, it starts to become worth something or whatever it is. So it was worth nothing. So I left his house the first time with a giant stack of Chamber of Chills and Dead of Night. And that was it, from then on. And a weird little postscript to that story. He, for whatever reason, he and I didn't talk for a very long time. He moved to California when we first started high school. We just lost touch. And then thanks to social media, we got back together, and he happened to be in St. Louis. And so he came by my house, and my comic book collection at the time was in my dining room. And so I had kind of like piles, so I kind of pulled it out, and I was like, and I pulled out all of, because I don't sell or get rid of anything. I have every issue that he sold me. And so I was like, look at this, man. I've still got everything. And it like literally took his breath away to see these things again. 40 years later, he was like, it almost makes me feel uncomfortable that I'm looking at these things that belonged to me when I was 12.
Here's a dime. I'll take them back.
So we talked about this, with EC and stuff like, and really, I guess all the horror comics that were anthologies. Do you know, Dan, was there any pre-code horror comics that were one singular story an issue?
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So now the most common format was the anthology format, and I would say that's probably 75 to 85% of them, honestly. So you have, whether it's Tales from the Crypt or Chamber of Chills or Beware or Mr. Mystery or The Thing, those are all those anthology series. But no, Avon did a lot of one-shots like City of the Living Dead, and there's one, what's it called? It's called Witch Doctor, something like that. So, and there were, I think, also a couple Fiction House one shots, and there were two or three other companies that did sort of one offs that were like whole stories. City of the Living Dead is an absolute masterpiece, and it's a 48 page Avon, I believe. I might be on the page count. And then there's what's the other one? There's one called the Dead That Walk, right? That is also kind of that may have two stories in it, but yeah, there were certainly some. Certainly not the standard way of doing it, though. Usually it would be the one and done anthology series, and the only thing that would perpetuate across them all would be the various hosts, right? The Galunatics for EC or the Man in Black or what it was going to be.
Were there other hosts? You said who else was maybe we should start. I don't know, because we're assuming some things here. I think a little bit that our audience knows. You know what I mean? I mean,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
we're
yeah.
assuming that they know
Yeah.
something about EC comics to begin with. So
Right.
should we? I guess EC is the most well known.
Well,
And Damien, you kind of mentioned some of those titles. But I wondered if we should just give people a better sense of what EC was and kind of what they were known for, real quick.
well, the EC story is the easiest to tell, and it's at the center of the whole pre-code controversy. So, EC was originally called Entertaining Comics, right? And it put out comics that were not great, picture stories from the Bible, picture stories from science, great moments in American history, that kind of thing, and put out by MC Gaines, who was one of the fathers of the modern comic book. He's one of the people that actually pioneered the idea of creating a multi-page pamphlet comic with reprint and/or original work from the newspapers. And he was more of a businessman than a creative director, and he put all his energies in. Eventually into this entertaining comics. I'm sorry, not entertaining. Educational comics. Educational comics was the first name. And then he died sadly in a boating accident, and his son took over. And the son was William Gaines, who was kind of an iconoclast, kind of a kind of a reserved guy, and but very interested in the subversive powers of art and narrative and literature, especially, and loved the sort of midnight horror radio shows that I know you guys have talked about, Lights Out and The Witch's Tale and things like that. And that's one of the places, one of the early prototypes for how he would create the Crypt Keeper and the Old Witch was borrowing from those radio shows. And those were also kind of anthology series. Every night there'd be a different horror story, and they could be vastly different. You could go to the moon, you could go to a haunted house, you could be a little it'd be an old man. It'd vary every time. So he really liked that. And he also was a big fan of the sort of classic American short story with O. Henry and Kate Chopin and the twist endings. So he and Bill Feldstein, Al Feldstein, sat down and would sort of come up with what they called springboard concepts, which is basically just like a high concept story, right? And they'd say, okay, so we'll take this family with kind of a cheating wife. How do we play with that? And they always had kind of a double surprise. So you wouldn't just have the twist ending; you'd have an extra twist ending. And they're not always like this, but they often verge on, as you said, they're really dark, bitter, ethical. Morality tales that they usually deal with vengeance or punishment for some kind of crime or infidelity or punishments for some kind of gluttony or vice or greed, but that there's usually a
Sin.
sin, lots of seven deadly sin stuff going on, but they also have a layer of black humor to them that I think is really, really important, because a lot of morality stories are not funny and not even witty. They're just dark. There's brutal, sort of fundamentalist. You must behave this way. There was something jolly in the darkness and the voodoo and the mischief and the zombies and the sort of revenant sadism that Gaines and Feldstein helped to put into EC. And I've never researched this, but I'd love to see it. I'd love to see the day when Feldstein and Gaines went into their artists and said to them, we're going to change gears, or we're thinking about changing gears, because they had been pumping out Western romances and history stories and stories of great scientists for several years, and all of a sudden, as you said, the artwork and the narrative structure and the visual continuity of these stories is unequaled. Some people call EC Comics the most literate comics of their time, and they might be right. And the great irony is that they're also so wordy. There's so much prose that you can almost not see all the fantastic art. So the creators were clearly really getting excited. And that's not even counting all the actual satires like Mad and Panic that were going on, or the war satires or the science fiction stories. So these were really, really carefully constructed, lovingly made, viciously rendered satires on everyday life. And again, a lot of it has to do with Cold War paranoia. A lot of it has to do with this sense of arch conformity. Some of it has to do with PTSD, and some of it has to do with just kids looking for thrills, right? So just like kids through the rock and roll or rap, it's the same thing. If you were I'm sure you guys all know this, but if you were a fan of EC Comics, you joined the EC Fan Addict Club, and you would mail away with your fan.
The word addict is a fun one to use.
Think about the word addict in 1950s teen culture. What that would have meant to walk around with that on your jacket, right? I am an EC addict. Think of what parents must have thought to see EC addict, right, on someone's shirt. And when they got their EC addict kit, they got like a fake certificate of authenticity that was kind of a pun, that was poking fun at all kinds of officiousness and seriousness. And the house ads for EC, the fan addicts are these little drooling, nasty little troll-like characters, right? That's the kid who's reading the comic. And really, because of that, those EC fan addicts, they were different. I mean, some of them read superhero comics and funny animal comics and Archie, I'm sure, but they tended to be a fairly different group. And they were the first group, one of the first groups, to start getting together and creating fan cultures and fanzines and sort of early conventions. As important as EC is to pre-code comics, a lot of people also say it's really important to comic book culture in general. Because the first EC fan addicts were the ones who started sending letters to each other and finding different ways to kind of share want lists and communicate beyond just the letters columns in the actual comics. So EC is
horror culture's first again.
That's right. So EC is at the center of this shift to these pre-code stories. And as was said so well earlier, there are lots and lots of reactions against them, but really it's Wortham's Seduction of the Innocent, where he shows clinical evidence, supposedly, that these comics are ubiquitous in the hands of juvenile delinquents, of sexually disturbed children, of all this stuff. I will also throw in a little plug for my friend Carol Tilley, who is an information science professor at University of Illinois, who has recently, in the past 5 years or so, I'm not exactly sure when, went back and looked at all of Wortham's original research and found that he actually lied. He actually doctored a lot of his own research to make the stuff look better. So not only was he wrong about comics being dangerous, he was also not a very good social scientist at all. I think he was generally meant well. I think he was he had studied at the studied at the Frankfurt School, and he was an expat who had fled the Nazis. So I think he really wanted the best for American capitalist democracy, but his methods were almost as bad as some of the pre-code stories themselves. So.
One interesting thing, I think, is the pre-code horror comics, I think, were more vicious than what was the horror movies that were out at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
You had your stuff from Universal and stuff like that, but the comics were much more violent, much more filled with monsters, much more gore for its time.
Yeah.
I feel like the closest you could come to what those pre-code comics were in movies was like the 60s Mexican Gothics. I think they would relate more those types of movies to the way the pre-code horror comics were than what was actually happening and obviously they came later in the 60s and stuff, but movies were definitely not keeping up with the comics at the time.
We just did an episode about what was most popular in 1953, 54, 55, and that was the big bug movies and the science, the atomic monster movies. And horror was really, like, as far as classic Gothic horror, there wasn't much being made in this during this era that we're talking about. The thing that I find interesting, though, is that it's so very different, than that kind of horror. Kind of like you were brushing up against. I'm writing, Damien, what you were saying. It's not like Gothic horror, and it's not like big bug science fiction. In fact, the only thing, as I was reading about it again today, with all these stories about revenge, these stories of regular people whose lives turn upside down, these naturalistic stories, it reminds me of the early tenets of the Grand Guignol Theater. Even though America really never had a tradition of the Grand Guignol until later, in a lot of ways, all the tenets of the early Grand Guignol in Paris are present in this stuff. This was America's Grand Guignol. This was America's sort of, because it combines the two things that the Grand Guignol was known for, because the Grand Guignol went back and forth between horror plays and comedies. And like you alluded to, Dan, there's this sense of there being this something that's very darkly funny about these things, which I think answers part of your other question too, right? Why is it so forbidden? Because if you're going to tell morality plays, you have to keep a straight face. You never smile. You know, you're not allowed to crack a smile while you're telling a morality story. Otherwise, you're suggesting that it's not really a morality story.
Right. And just to follow up on that, I'm always surprised that more people don't talk about this, but one of the most recurrent themes on the covers of EC horror comics, and in fact a lot of horror comics, is scenes of beheading with axes and with guillotines and with hangings. So like the Grand Guignol, all these public execution forms, all these sort of official kinds of punishment, and always at the moment of the actual neck breaking or the axe coming down, or you see the body convulse when the big blade has fallen, and that emphasis on execution is very, very much Grand Guignol, because there's a Tales from the Crypt that's absolutely ridiculous. It's the cover is actually depicting the French Revolution, and there's this body flying up in the air as the blade comes down, and it's absolutely ludicrously funny, right? And it shouldn't be, but it is. There's I think it's a Tales from the Crypt, might be a Vault of Horror with a masked executioner, with someone putting their head down to go into the basket just before the axe comes down. And again, it's this moment that's incredibly shocking, intense, and unnerving, but it's as funny as it is scary. It's actually that cover in particular is colored really brightly and beautifully. It's got this kind of romance color, purple and orange and green to it that's not horror based at all. And that tells us a lot of things, that we're dealing with the entertainment of execution, very much like the Grand Guignol and the comedy of it, but we're also dealing with, again, a kind of indictment of the hypocrisies and corruptions of capitalist democracy, that we're sort of looking at guillotines from the age of the birth of democracy and revolution. So there's a one Howard Chaykin called it once. He talked to me once, and he was like, there's a liberal paranoia in EC Comics that is really entertaining, because everyone's sort of saying, what if, it didn't work? What if people did, if people were as vile as these stories really say they are? There's a real concern that the fabric of American culture is much more fragile and much more incendiary than we like to think it is.
Or they could have just waited 50, 60 years and it come to be true.
My students who are reading these stories now, that's exactly how they respond. They're like, so we're basically living in the EC nightmare. I'm like, yeah.
I do think the movies slowly did follow them. I mean, you had Hammer coming out in 57 that started the gore color.
It was all years after,
it wasn't around 50, the same. Only 3 or 4 years after 54 when they started, right?
Yeah, but that's
or when they ended. I'm sorry, but even still, you had William Castle. Even though they're in black and white, he was always having heads being shown or
but again,
thrown around,
right? Not till 59 or 60.
But it's close, Damien.
It's close. It's not happening at the same time. It's not happening at the same time.
What is close though, and even earlier, are those late night radio shows. Those are gruesome as hell, right?
Yes.
And also, I think the horror comics are also channeling the sort of late night spook shows, right? The stuff where they're doing all the weird fake voodoo and magic tricks and beheadings up on stage. That's very, very much where this stuff is coming from.
When did and I don't know if it was called the MPAA at the time, but when did any kind of movie rating system come into effect?
Not until much, much later.
Well, you had
60s. 60s.
It was the 60s.
Yeah.
You had the Hayes. You're talking about for film?
Yeah.
You had the
Hayes Code in the 30s.
Yeah.
That just said you can't do anything other than this. The Motion Picture Association of ratings, I'm pretty sure, came out in the late 60s.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder if it's because, well, I guess that's kind of saying like movies weren't as completely regulated either, just like these horror comics. I mean, you had that EC cover with the severed arm hanging on the the subway thing, and I don't know if it was
Horror.
like
Yeah,
Black Cat Mysteries, but
with
the
the guy with
person's
his face
face
falling
is
apart.
dissolved.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and like
I have a fantastic story to tell about that particular comic later. But the other thing that we have to remember always is that why did the people always say, and they're 100% right about this, that the crime comics, pre-code crime comics begat pre-code horror comics, right? And pre-code crime comics began because there was a market for it. People were buying them. Comics, like every other popular medium, follow trends. And the superhero was dying off after World War II, and a lot of comics were kitty oriented, funny animals, Woody Woodpecker, Felix the Cat, Uncle Scrooge, that kind of thing. And there wasn't really a comic for the new sort of 12 to 18-year-old range beyond just the traditional westerns and romance comics. And crime comics filled that hole. There was something there that was edgy and raw and urban and new and different. And to up the ante to make money, the horror comics were sort of born out of that, and they were a massive commercial success, which is why there were so many of them, why it exploded into like between 1,400 and 2,000 different titles. Some titles only lasting 1 or 2 issues. Sometimes they changed names 4 or 5 times. Sometimes they took actual existing comics and played with the title, right? Captain America, the great Marvel comic of World War II, becomes, for the last 2 issues, Captain America's Weird Tales, or 3 issues maybe. In the last couple issues of it, Captain America is not even on the cover. It's just a thing coming out of a crate to sort of attack this young blonde woman. So we can see the horror trend kind of starting there. And Trend is just it. I think EC Comics and several other companies really wanted to put out strong comics. Whether or not they were being ethical about it is another question. A lot of the other ones were just sort of copycats and ripoffs that were trying to cash in on the trend. And that's where some of the most bizarre and gruesome stories tend to come from. Which is the same reason why we got films that needed to be rated, right? Because no one was going to the movies anymore, so they had to put they had to create whole new ways of getting people to go to the movies.
I have this pet theory about this whole era in the comics code itself, which is just that kind of what you were just talking about, Dan. I don't think there was as much distinction about what is defined as horror. I mean, the word horror had been used since the 30s, so we're 20 years into the word horror being used to define a kind of genre. But I think that the edges were more permeable at this time, and so EC was putting out things like Crime Suspense Stories, which was a crime comic, but still look like horror. There's a bunch of issues that look like horror, and the war comics were gory from EC. The science fiction stuff had monsters in it. Yeah, and so I feel like the comics code, now it didn't specifically target horror by name, but I often think the comics code helped solidify the dread of horror in our society. Like, it was still sort of talked about that way. So it's funny, in a kind of a way, while it was really rotten for the kids at the time, I have this feeling that without the comics code authority happening, horror wouldn't have sort of been this. Horror became like punk rock for a few years. Like, as soon as your kid gets a mohawk, it's like, that, it's all gone wrong. And same thing, like your kid got into horror movies or horror comics in the 50s. Oh no, like things have gone real bad. So, and that's one of the things I've always loved about horror, is this sense that it's going to make your tight ass grandma run for the hills.
Right. We've all.
No offense to anybody who has loose ass grandmas. Like my grandmas were awesome and let me do whatever I wanted. So I'm talking about just the tight ass grandmas here.
I've never contemplated my grandma's ass, but I guess I probably should find out where she fits. She probably would have loved it.
It's a metaphor. It's a metaphor. I don't want to think about real grandma asses.
Oh God!
There's a dark turn.
Yeah.
A dark turn up Granny's ass.
I feel like the Crypt Keeper is going to show up any moment now. No, Aaron, I completely agree with you. And there's also this. We've always known that the EC Comics readership was fairly small by comparison. Like they sold well, but they never sold enormously well. Like Dell Comics was still the greatest of all sales, so everyone was still buying the Lone Ranger and Lassie and Woody Woodpecker and that stuff. Those were the great million print run comics or enormous print run comics. And then probably to some extent, some of the other genre comics, some of the Western, some of the romance comics, but EC always had a steady, solid readership. We also now know, thanks to some of the research that's being done by people, I'm very glad to know that there was a strong African American readership for EC Comics, and there was also a strong female readership that has never gotten talked about, because when all those fan groups started coming together, all those EC fan addicts started joining up, there were very few people who weren't just typical white boys. But there was a strong black readership for what EC had to say. And it's not surprising why, because clearly mainstream culture had not done most African Americans any major favors, right? And there's even stories in the liberal paranoia books, like shock suspense stories. There's a story called The Whipping, where a guy is terrified that his daughter is going to run away and marry this Mexican guy, and they call him words you can't even imagine being in a comic in the 1950s, and something horrible happens at the end that I won't give away. But there's a lot of real strong lessons about honest American prejudice in these stories. Certainly, the most famous EC story of all is Joe Orlando's Judgment Day, about the black astronaut who's come to Siberia, and he has to decide if the blue and the orange robots are going to join the great galactic senate or whatever. It's one of the most powerful stories ever written in comics. It might be one of the best American comic stories. To this day, students love it, and that was a story that actually got them in trouble with the Code. When they were going to reprint it, the Code didn't want to print it because it had such a powerful liberal message. And they said, how does it violate the Code? And they said, well, when the astronaut takes off his helmet, you can see that he's sweating. And we can't allow for any kind of bodily presence of perspiration or fluid or anything like that. And Gaines went bananas. He actually fought them. He says, no, I'm going to print it the way it is. And if you don't like it, I'll take you to court. Because that story had already won an award from the NAACP, or gotten an accommodation at the NAACP. So it was a very powerful story. So no other comics at the time were dealing with issues like that. So there was a readership of people who had been marginalized, a readership of people who understood the corruption and the hypocrisy and the limitations of American democracy, who were really finding a lot of solace in EC and some of the other pre-code stories also. So yes, it's certainly there.
Just imagine some of the younger kids reading that stuff that maybe, because of the way they're brought up, are leaning towards the right, and they're reading this and going, wow, that's actually making me think. And of course they're not going to want them to. You can't be doing that.
Well, yeah, and lots of parents don't want them thinking that particular way either. I mean, some parents probably do.
Exactly.
Some parents probably do. There's a famous essay by Robert Warshaw, the guy who wrote one of the great books on the westerns, that Aaron and I put in our class, about him watching his son read EC Comics and become an EC fan addict. And Warshaw is a very independent thinker, very, very astute critical mind. He thinks it's great. He's like, this kid has found his idiom for satire that for me would have been like Mark Twain and jazz, right? But he's found this new thing that does, or for the 90s kids, it would be The Simpsons, and for the 80s kids, it would be punk rock or industrial or something like that. So he's like, I love watching this happen. This is important. He's, these kids are kind of goofy and they're kind of immature, and they tend to not always be super responsible, but they're learning what satire is, and they're learning how they can use dissent as a kind of weapon against things that are going to make the world worse. So he's one of the few voices that speaks out for these things and says, yeah, there's all this controversy. There's book burnings and, parents groups and book of the month clubs, condemning comics, just like heavy metal and just like video games. He says, but there are lessons here. There are important lessons, and there's art here. So yeah, not all parents, but you're right. A lot of people don't want their kids to think freely or independently. It's true.
I don't care what the book has in it. If you're actually going to a book burning, you have crossed the line.
I don't even want to think of being around one of those. It would not go well for me.
No.
Yeah, and what's amazing with all this pre-code, because of that, they did burn a lot of these comics and whatnot, and these comics were I don't know, like 10, 25 cents at the time.
10
So,
cents. 10 cents.
right, 10 cents. So completely disposable thing. Nobody was really saving or collecting these comics back then. And it's amazing what we actually have that survived this time, thankful for those people that did.
Well, yeah, and that's one of the reasons why the two most expensive kinds of comics in the world are the Golden Age superhero comics because of the paper drives, because they got rid of them all. And then the few Golden Age superhero comics that survived the paper drives probably got tossed into the 50s book burnings. So there's very, very few of those. And then then the same thing with the pre-code comics. Those were some of the first ones to be targeted as vile or pornographic or dangerous or subversive. So yeah, they are rare on purpose because people freaking destroyed them. Also,
Yeah.
a lot of people who had them didn't treat them very well because they were reading them like crazy and they just fell apart. So
Right.
And they weren't necessarily printed on the best materials. I mean, they weren't intended to be durable goods.
Yeah, no. Charlton had their own presses in the basement, and they're notoriously bad for page copy. So, or the sort of page quality and color runs and all kinds of awful things. So here's a great example. That book that you mentioned, the Black Cat. I forget the number, with the guy whose his face is being melted off by some kind of nuclear atomic thing, right? And it's one of the most horrific horror comic covers of all time. I was telling Aaron about this earlier today. Through channels that would take too long to explain, somebody called me about a year ago. Her stepfather had passed away, and they got along great. And her stepfather was a very serious and successful urban planner who, for fun at night to unwind, would collect Golden Age art, would collect pre-code horror comics. That's all he did. And they wanted someone to look at the collection and help them sort of ferret it out. So I picked a couple people to go with me, and we went down to where they were, and we're talking 1,500 comics, very, very carefully preserved with extensive notes. The guy was very, very lovingly compulsive about every single line. He had prices for every book he bought, and I have never seen a collection like this. Complete runs of everything, complete runs of the ECs, complete runs of the St. John's, complete runs of the LB Coles. So we've been helping her dispose of them in the most appropriate way, and we pulled maybe 20 that are especially rare and especially hard to find and especially expensive, and took pictures of them, and we offered them to people for private sale. And one guy saw that book. He saw that we had a copy of that book, and he said he's very rarely ever even seen a copy. And this book was beat. It was almost completely the cover was almost completely detached. If you graded it, it wouldn't come back very strong at all. Probably a 1 or a 1.5. We called it a 1.5. And but the cover was clean. You could see the whole gruesome show. And he said, well, let me think about it. And this was in Kansas City in February. Maybe 2 days later, he texted me. He said, if you bring me that book, I'll pay you cash. And the price tag was $7,500. Now, of all the books in that collection, this is the only one I never wanted to touch again because the cover was so barely hanging on. So a friend of mine agreed to drive very, very carefully back to Kansas City. And we gave him the book, and he gave us $7,500 in cash for that one book. So that love for that stuff is still there. And even I would never buy a comic book for $7,500. But if I was going to do that, I would open it up and check every damn page. He never even opened it. He said, he said, I'm afraid I don't want to rip the cover. I'm going to keep it like this for now. I'll decide what I'm going to do with it later.
Wow.
So that's the intensity and the rarity and the scarcity of some of these books. A couple of books in that collection, the Startling Terror Tales with the Spider Beast and the famous Chamber of Chills that was used for the Misfits album cover, we sent those off to private auction, and they're probably going to go for $10,000 or more each.
Good thing we collect cheap posters, Damien.
Yeah, right.
Now, Damien, don't you wish you would have started that pre-code horror comic
You know,
collection?
this was almost like probably 15 years ago. Had I
Yeah.
started that collection 15 years ago, yeah, I might have some good stuff.
Well, maybe, but these books have always been rare, and even when you do find them, they are always beat. So, my one goal when I went down there was I wanted to get a William Eckren cover. William Eckren was a sort of a lunatic psychedelic graphic designer. He only did 3 pre-code horror covers. There's only 3, and you never see them, and they were all there. And even though I put in hours and hours of work, I still couldn't, fairly and honestly. I mean, those books were going to be $2,000 and $3,000 a piece, and I probably could have said, "Look, I just like this one book for the time I put in," but I just didn't. I didn't want her to get ripped off. So someone greater than me wound up with those covers. But that'll give you an idea. And I've never seen all three in one place ever. So that was a pretty exciting moment, just to have them all laid out like that.
Dad showed me pictures too. I love the images of, because the guy stored them in 3-ring binders.
Yeah.
And so there was just this wall of binders.
Yeah.
Which if you walked in, that would look pretty innocuous, but there's tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars comic books in there.
Yeah.
And I also love the part where you told me that as you were like going like, well, this one will go for $7,000 to $10,000.
Yeah.
She's like, he bought that in 1983 for $200.
Oh no! Oh, he never paid $200. No, that was the funniest part. So we were doing it, and they grade by committee. So we thought we should grade by committee. So we pulled the most expensive ones, and I would give it a grade and write it down, and my friend would give it a grade and write it down. My other friend would give it a grade and write it down, and then we'd kind of figure out where we were, because these are very rare books. We wanted to make sure it worked out well. So for like the Chamber of Chills 19, the famous one with the glass, right? The one they used in the Misfits cover. That's probably, we thought it would be about a 5. And so then we'd look up the different auction houses and see what the average price was. The average price is between $8,000 and $10,000. And she'd look it up in her little book, and she'd say, "Oh, he paid $3.72 for it in 1983." Right? The most expensive book I think he bought was $100, maybe. So she was tickled pink, and she knew she had value. She just didn't know how to go about it. But it was great fun and we also, this is worth talking about, I think, on a podcast like this. Like, he did this completely independently. He would go to shows and he would buy the pre-code books, and he had his want list and his checklist and everything. But as far as she knew, and she grew up with him, he never had friends to sit down and talk about it with him. He didn't have the kind of community that we all have, right? And it was fun to do, and we were very happy to do it and to help her out. But we'd come home, we'd be kind of sad. Like, this poor guy, Richard, never had anyone to share this with. He loved it. He never, felt bad about it. And his wife, who had no interest in it at all, thought it was kind of cute that he'd, sit down next to her and read about all these gruesome vampire beheadings and things. And she just thought it was kind of funny. But he never really had anyone to kind of bounce this off of. So there's the fan cultures for horror in general are so diversified and so interesting. And this guy who did this amazing thing, there will probably not be another collection like this. Just did it for himself. Just did it kind of honestly, quietly by himself.
And that's a specialized collection,
Yeah, and he didn't have. You were talking about the gemstone reprints from the '90s or the big hardback. He didn't have any of that. It was just it was the pure crack. It was just the pure stuff and only the stuff.
So it's one thing to collect horror comics, but when you're like, I'm only collecting pre-code horror comics.
Right. Oh yeah. No.
And apparently nothing else. Like, no evidence of any other comics in the house, right?
None.
Just those. And I love that you also said that he had like a almost OCD like quality to his personality.
Yes. So they told us, like I said, he was an urban planner. I think he was very, very much, focused on specific details. They said when he would lock up the house for the night, he would go around and check every window several times and lock the door several times. And there would be a little dent in the door where he'd push his knee up against it after so many years. And I think horror comics gave him a way to cope with that, because they're so sloppy and messy and gruesome and rough. And they're very carefree in their use of puns and their use of just gaudy images and colors. I think it really soothed him a little bit and allowed him to do that. And we also, not only did he have a little notebook where we showed where he paid for everything, he had meticulous notes on every book he bought with bibliographic information down to tears that were 1/4 of an inch for every single book. So he physically loved these objects, right? They meant something to him in really, really important ways.
Do you guys do that with your poster collections? You sit down and like, upper right-hand corner, there's a 1/8 of an inch tear.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking to someone that still hasn't even finished inventory
Exactly.
posters, let alone,
right?
Oh, this one's got a 1/2 inch. Shit. This is the same guy that's Oh, I'll keep this poster. Go to put it. Oh, fuck! I already have that. God damn it.
Yeah.
So
I got a poster the other day. I didn't even open the box yet, or the package it came in.
I'll, if you don't mind, Aaron, I'll tell you the other story too. So we took a small box of those books up to the Windy City Pulp and Paper Show that I know a lot of you guys know, which is mostly for pulp collectors, but there's high end comics people there too. And we put high prices on them. I said if we can always come down, but we're gonna. And this was all for her. We were working as agents for her collection. And my friend who owns the shop said, "You'll give me 10 minutes or so, and then come over and give me a hand." So I walked down the aisle and I was looking at some Arkham House books and looking at some Lovecraft and having a good old time. And I don't think it was 5 minutes. And I turned around and I couldn't see my friend's booth anymore. People, it was like a swarm of locusts had descended. I don't think they must have smelled it when he opened the box. And there were people from all over the country, and it was like a scene from Night of the Living Dead with all the hands coming through the door to try to get a hold of these books. And we sold at least half of them within an hour before the show opened.
Wow.
Without having to haggle much?
No, there was no haggling. I made it very clear. The price is the price. These are not our books. We're just the shepherds here, and people forked it over. One guy bought well over $6,000 worth of books and gave me the list for what else he wanted. Right, and he one other guy emails me every 2 weeks with the 2 books he wants every 2 weeks. I told him I wasn't going back for a long time. Every 2 weeks I still get that message. So there is an intense, obsessive love for the physical material. There really is. The reprints you can read online for free, and the reprints you can get very cheaply. But people want the real thing.
Sure.
So,
we've been to the Windy City Show a couple of times. Alan, our
yeah.
friend of the show, goes up there.
Yeah.
And
I sat
he
next to him
goes
at
to
the
the auctions.
Yep.
Yeah, he goes to the auctions and always messages me, "Oh, well, someone just paid X amount of dollars for a postcard from H.P. Lovecraft." And I'm just sitting there going, "What? Somebody paid how much?"
No, I was actually sitting right next to him when that happened. It was unbelievable. The one that kills me is you know the famous Weird Tales cover with the woman with the bat mask on. It's been turned into an album cover. You see it all the time.
Yeah, I know that one.
Yeah, 2 or 3 years ago, they had a nice copy for auction. It went for I think $11,000. And the auctions are fascinating because there are people there who clearly that's all they want is they want this Weird Tales or they want this Astonishing, and they don't care what it costs. Like one guy had waited years and years and years to find some science fiction pulp I've never even heard of, and he said I'm 75 years old and I have one that's missing and I don't care what it costs today, and I'm sure he spent close to 2,000 to get it. So, but that letter was weird because it was from what's his name? It was to Lovecraft from the Conan guy. What's the Conan guy's name?
Oh, Robert E. Howard.
Yeah. It was. If I remember correctly, it was from Howard to Lovecraft, and it was basically just a sightseeing postcards, like having a nice time in
Arkham.
Yeah, well, yeah. Well, it was something even more dull and mundane than that. It was like having a nice time in Florida. See you soon, and it was and it was addressed to Lovecraft, and it was signed to him. I just thought, God, that's an awful lot of money to pay for something like that. But again, there's a provenance to it that people just they feel like their fandom, they feel like their identity, they feel like their personal and professional continuity is tied to these things. It's fascinating, right? And like the EC comics themselves, is a little scary and a little funny at the same time.
I want to go back to what you said earlier, Dan, that, and this isn't horror related, but it's comic related. What you talking about when they're reading the panels and how actually that helps young readers be able to connect stories. My son, I passed my Calvin and Hobbes collections onto my son when he was in grade school, and he just devoured those like I did. He wouldn't read regular books. He would just read the comic books. So when his third grade parent teacher conference, I'm complaining to her, he just reads these. He won't read regular books. And she gives me an earful going of all these tech. Well, you know, if you by reading comics, they are understanding this and this and this. And here I'm feeling like a little 3-year-old going, okay, I guess that's okay. But it's a part of comics that I never understood how effective that can be.
So because comics are multimodal, they're both prose and pictures. Forget the content. Doesn't matter if it's pre-code horror or westerns or superheroes or what. They've always had that stigma because they don't fit into the arch traditional channels of literacy, right? So for years, people said, don't give your kids comics because they won't be able to read Moby Dick, right? Or don't give your kids comics because they'll never appreciate great art. They'll just see all this crappy, awful, highly ethnicized art, and they'll think it's terrible. But in fact, any comic, it doesn't matter what it is, the cognitive and the semantic and the cultural and the narrative structures that make comics work really encourage both visual and prosaic literacies, and that's been proven many different ways. So that teacher was actually right, and Calvin Hobbes is a great example because that's a man who agonizes over every panel of what he puts together.
Yeah.
So those are not just fun comics; they're great comics too, right? Just like a lot of the EC stories are just great comics, like Master Race, Judgment Day, Taint the Meat. These are brilliantly, carefully orchestrated stories. There's a lot of junk out there too, just like there's a lot of junk horror movies, right? And then the good ones are why you all are here, yeah. Hopefully, and good is a relative term.
We try to define that every show.
Right? Yeah, of course.
That's good or not.
Yeah, no, good is if you like it, right?
Yeah.
I don't believe in good and bad. I believe you like it or you don't. That's really all that there is. I think good and bad is actually trying to create structures and hierarchies where none belong.
I agree.
And trying to create an us versus them.
Well, I've devoted an enormous portion of my life to horror comics, so I agree with you on that one.
It's all a sham.
Yeah.
Pretty early on in the history of our show, we did an episode about magazines. We discussed one of the things that we discussed at the time was the gore on the covers of Fangoria magazines in the early 80s. And what a revelation that was to so many of us to sort of go to the grocery store and see a dismemberment on the cover of a magazine. It was just like, I can't believe I'm seeing this. But it's funny, I've got I don't have any really pre-code horror comics originally, but I have a lot of collections of reprints of pre-code horror comics because I'm not one of those people that needs the originals on many things. We get to the Warren episode, I'll tell you where my need for that kind of stuff is, but because it's all there. But I have all these collections of these things, and I look through them, and one of the books I have in particular is mostly a collection of covers, and it is astonishing when you see them one after another, the kinds of covers that were finding their way to 5 and dime stores and nickel candy stores in the most conservative time in modern history in an America that just doesn't exist anymore. And the idea of that, of walking into Kroger in 1952 and seeing a dismembered head with a bullet through the forehead being held up by a crazy looking, zombie or whatever it is bananas. I just can't think of a time when there was anything that lurid. Even the stuff on Fango covers, I don't think quite gets because like you said, Dan, very often the violence it wasn't just like we're seeing a zombie or like we're seeing somebody in a makeup after the thing had happened. You're seeing it at the moment. You're seeing the head in the hand with the bloody axe in the other. You're seeing it right then. I mean, the implicit message that's coming through is the crime has just been committed. So it's like, I don't know, there's something about that it's like when we talk about the reason that they got banned, I just imagine that for a lot of people I see, especially now on social media, you see people who are just knee-jerk reactions to things. There's a page I follow that makes jokes it's alternative photographic history, and they put up a picture of somebody, like put up a picture of Carrot Top, and they're like, happy birthday to, and they pick somebody who doesn't look at all like Carrot Top. Right. And it's funny. And you see all these people who come in and they're like, that's not Carrot Top. What the hell is wrong with you people? And I just imagine that people whose only understanding of horror comics at the time is what they see next to Good Housekeeping while they're buying their Wonder Bread. They just make that super fast decision of that's bad stuff. Right. And so it doesn't surprise me in the least that these things got banned, that they became the specific target of these pogroms, because people put things in simple boxes, and when you give them an easy target, they will usually aim for.
It's true. It's true. And so the great code forming, the sort of founding of the comics code, um, there is a certain argument to be made for some of the content in the horror comics and in the crime, and especially in the jungle comics. If you look at racism and sexism and sort of rape metaphors, that probably should not have been sold to children. And there is certain content there that little kids, they would have been traumatized by. But little kids weren't going to take the jungle comics and the horror comics and the crime comics. They were going to take the little kid comics, right? That's just how it works. Usually. So they had actually pretty much worked out kind of a backroom deal, if my history is accurate, where they were just going to sort of say, okay, we're sorry if we let this stuff out in the public a little too regularly. We'll find a way to regulate it and we'll calm it down. But then Bill Gaines' famous testimony about Crime Suspense 22 kind of opened up a can of worms, and then they had to create the codes. So it was kind of a messy situation. But you're right about the covers. So a comic book cover has two jobs: to advertise what is inside and to make sure that it is more interesting than the comic book cover sitting next to it on the gigantic rack of 9 million comic book covers. So horror comics were especially good at using graphic design and outrageous, figure ground and bold color to really make people say, "Oh, look, there is the horror comic," as opposed to the funny animal or the superhero or the western or the romance. So they do stand out in big, bold, wild ways. Usually with some sort of sadistic violence, often the famous injury to eye motif, often the woman in the red dress. Both the horror comics and the crime comics share the woman in the red dress, who's sort of a sexualized sort of rape metaphor figure. So there were certain codes that they used to draw people who were interested in those kind of thriller and shock based stories. And the master of it, all of the EC horror covers were lovingly designed, right? And in fact, my favorite thing about EC are the cover fonts. Those incredible letters with all of the rich, crazy design going on in them, and the three circles going down the side of the Vault Keeper, the Crypt Keeper, and the Old Witch. That has become seminal to world graphic design. Manga copies it, movie posters copy it, cartoonists and animators copy it all the time. So there's something about that cover design that's really infamous and important. I've even seen horror novel dust jackets copy it as well. And of course, we all know Creepshow, the famous Creepshow book, does the same thing. It looks very much like an EC cover, right? Yeah. The other great master, though, is L.B. Cole, who'd been working in all genres of comics most of his life. But when he started to work for Star Comics and he started to put their horror covers together, I read a blog recently that said he's the father of psychedelic design. I'm not sure that's true, but his colors were absolutely outrageously gorish, gawkish, boldish, loudish, crazy cover designs with outlandish covers, big crazy reds against greens and purples, and his jungle horror comics are they are a freaking fever dream. They don't make just the covers alone are masterpieces of lust and desire and pain and torture and violence and every taboo subject you can think of. The girls, the beautiful blonde Caucasian girls in the zebra striped bikinis, being chased by crazy white people and crazy native savages with animals and ghouls and witch doctors, is cover after cover after cover. Is just, there's nothing else like it in the history of American print media. And again, maybe that's a bad thing. I'm sorry, maybe that's a good thing, but there's just so much going on in there. They're also, for my money, they're full of sex and desire, but they're some of the queerest covers I've ever seen too. They're so outlandish and over the top that there's a certain kind of camp factor going.
I did. There's a documentary that came out in 2004 on Tales from the Crypt, from the comics. I think it's from the comics to the television.
Is there?
Yeah.
But it has actual footage of Gaines at the
Mhm.
Senate committee,
Yeah.
which I knew kind of about that before, but this
Uh-huh.
documentary really opened up stuff when
Yeah.
all the crap that they were going through and all the shit that Wortham was saying, and to your point, Dan, that was
Mhm.
later proven bullshit. Um, it's pretty fascinating when you get into it. And plus, some of these artists that weren't technically horror fans, but they're like, "Oh, you want me to draw this? Okay."
Right.
And then they knock out this incredible piece of art
Right.
that they probably didn't even like, but it was very
Right.
effective.
Yeah, like Jack Davis, right? I mean, he did so much amazing EC stuff, but then he went on to what? Mad?
Yeah,
Or
Mad and movie posters and album covers and
yeah.
Yeah.
so many, magazine covers. Yeah, I mean, his
I mean, he drew Uncle Creepy.
yeah, right. Yeah, you're in creepy. That's right. The games thing is I think you can watch it online as well. The full the full testimony that he gives. And then
Okay.
there's a 1990s documentary about comics called Comic Book Confidential that has a great little bit on EC, and it's actually got Bill Gaines sitting there talking about it all and talking about the horrors, the sort of pre-code movement. It's really quite smart. It also includes the famous TV condemnation of comics from what is it called? Confidential Report, where it has all these kids who are being demented by comic books. It's absolutely ridiculous. And there's also, if you want to, the full uncut story, David Hodgdew's The 10 Cent Plague. It's probably the best
Yeah.
treatment of the history of the horror comics ever, and that goes day by day and sometimes hour by hour in the way that it all breaks down. So there's
I've read that.
yeah,
That was really, really fascinating. And that it's like I know this much about horror comics, and you start to read that, and you're like, the fact that even you pointed out how many of these
yeah,
comics were being published.
yeah.
Good Lord, they were everywhere. But I could totally see a very uptight 50s mom freaking out, or which I, again, to your point, I've never thought about. The father's coming home from the war, seeing very, very traumatic things, and now their kids reading a magazine that shows kind of the same thing. That had to freak them out.
Right, which sounds a lot like the opening of Creepshow, doesn't it? With the guy in the comic
Right.
book, and then you're in this shit,
Yeah.
pop beer at
It's
the
just it's amazing that this comic code literally destroyed a whole multiple genres of
yeah,
comics.
yeah,
I mean,
Yeah.
it's
it
true.
literally destroyed them for almost 20 years.
Well, comics, but it's reborn just by somebody going, "Hey, if we made it this much bigger, yeah,
Yeah,
and then we get this amazing thing where not only do they get reborn in that format, but all of those same artists that were still in the industry get to have a job again for a little
Yeah.
while."
and so not only are there's three stories there with the post code horror. One is that the horror comics come back in bigger form, right, in the magazines, but they come back better than ever because you have the veteran horror creators, but you also have all this whole new movement of creators who have gone to art school who want to make comics into art. So you've got Bernie Wrightston, you've got Jeffrey Jones, you've got Mike Kaluta, you've got Bruce Jones, all these people who want to tell even more sophisticated, more uncensored stories using horrific themes. So they're even better than they were before. The second story, and I wish I knew more about this, but the second story is that, as you said, a lot of companies were just fly-by-night exploitation jobs anyway. But a lot of significant publishing and comic book companies died on the vine because of the comic book stigma, and a lot of creators, many of which we've never been able to really trace, right, who were probably suffering from PTSD or who were processing their war experiences in some way. People like Steve Ditko were kind of fell off into oblivion and never worked in comics again. If they worked in art again, it's hard to say. Many of them also had other kinds of problems, psychological problems, addiction problems, social paranoia problems, but those comics helped to deal with those things. And the third story is, and one of my favorites, is that one company refused to submit to the code, and that was Dell. And they said, "We have the largest market share. We've always said parents can relax when kids read Dell comics. We're not going to turn in jack shit to you ever. And we have all the licenses with all the major Hollywood properties, Disney, Warner Brothers, MGM, all the TV properties, Howdy Doody, Leave It to Beaver, I Love Lucy. We don't have to show you jack." And they didn't. And because of that, there were some occasional surprises in those Dell and Gold Key comics. Dell eventually turns into Gold Key, that had some pretty interesting horror themes in them. One of them was a sort of a fall Halloween special called Tales from the Tomb, and it's a big, huge, monster, oversized book. And the art is god awful, and the stories look very clean, but they're disturbing as hell. They're really, really darkly written stories because they were never submitted to the code. And then later on in the early '60s, Dell put out Gold Key at the time put out a Boris Karloff's thrillers. They put out the Twilight Zone. They put out Dark Shadows. They put out one. I wrote down the name because I always forget this name. Grimm's Ghost Stories, Boris Karloff's Tales of Mystery, Ripley's Believe It or Not True Ghost Stories, The Occult Files of Dr. Spectre. These were all horror books, and none of them were ever code submitted or code approved. Now, they don't go too far, and they certainly follow a lot of the stuff that they don't do a lot of the stuff that got EC in trouble. But there is this other weird crabgrass strain of horror comics that continues through the 60s until, again, the publishers, out of desperation for lack of money, say screw the code and just start doing what they want to do again. So
yeah, right. So I mean, they obviously loosened up the code because Marvel was starting to put out Werewolf by Night and Tomb of Dracula and stuff like that.
Correct, and Morbius and all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Does the code still exist today? And did they rewrite it?
I think it's pretty much close shut. Now I should check. That's a great question. I'm pretty sure it became pretty much a defunct thing in the mid '90s, but it was still fairly alive and well and active in the '80s because you still see the code approved stamp well into the '80s.
Yeah.
But you'd have all kinds of stuff like Frank Miller did his Angel Dust story in the '80s, and that's code approved. All the Punisher stories with all of their urban violence are all code approved. So.
And then I guess
I just looked it up. Marvel didn't abandon it officially until 2001.
Okay.
And DC and Archie didn't until 2011.
Okay.
Wow.
Completely abandoned the code. But you're right. I think that by the 90s, nobody was submitting to it.
Right.
Well,
which is especially funny because some of those early 2000 Archies are some of the raunchiest drawings you are ever going to see in comics anywhere, and they're getting code approved. So go figure.
I guess the other thing is with direct to market, the comic shops
Yes.
coming up, it's not like this stuff is going straight to newsstand anymore, and that's the only place you could buy it.
That's right.
It's not like these comic shops are like, oh, this is not a code approved comic, we're not carrying it. You didn't need that anymore like you did back then, where the distribution, like, well, we're not taking anything that doesn't have the code on it.
When I was a kid in the mid '70s, I never saw no one ever said anything about code or not code. It was on all the comics except the Dell Gold Key Whitman comics because they never submitted. But no, even Dell changed some things though. They pulled back on an awful lot of ethnic and gender stereotyping in the '60s and '70s just to avoid what had happened to EC. So some of their editors would change things around from time to time, but I mean those Twilight Zone comics, they're every bit as terrifying as Tales from the Crypt. Every single one of them. They're some of the best horror comics ever, honestly.
The first time I think that you read the pre-code stuff, especially, the writing is different than modern comics writing. The writing's just different in general. The art looks different. Like you said, it was before people were going to art school. There's a specific style. So you have some experience actually helping people then into this style of comics. And what would you say about how to approach this stuff if people are hesitant, if they're like, this reads weird or this looks weird?
So I don't have to do a lot of coaching. I kind of let them know that whatever comics class I teach, we go historically forward. So I say, if you're looking for the modern stuff, we'll get there at the end, but we have to learn, the context and the background, see where we're going. It's fascinating to me because the horror comic class I teach, we actually start with 19th century book illustration. So our Arthur Rackham and the Decadence and things like that, and then we move into pulp illustration, and then we start looking at early comic strips. There are some horror comic strips, believe it or not, and then we move on to the stuff. But they get kind of a mini course in the the history of narrative illustration as they move forward. And they're always a little hesitant because just like students are with silent film, they're like, oh my God, a silent movie. But then, a good story is a good story. It doesn't matter what the hell medium it's in. If it catches your attention, and some of them are timeless and some of them aren't. By that third class, usually they're all in. They're like, I had no idea. That's the thing I hear the most often. I had no idea. I had no idea that you could tell that people were telling stories like this back then. They especially love Master Race and Judgment Day. They get very excited about those stories. Master Race is so visually fascinating and so very much ahead of its time. They're like, what's going on in this panel? How does he even do that? How does this panel connect to that panel? And they see that structure. But you're right, it's completely different from what modern comics are. It doesn't have the manga and the anime influence. It doesn't have the Image Comics influence. It doesn't have the underground comics influence. So they are seeing these very, very polished stories, often rendered by not so polished artists. And I also they also have a lot of fun playing with some of the gender and race themes in the stories, because one of the things that would make you a comic artist is that you were Jewish, right? You couldn't work in the mainstream newspaper comic strip world or even the illustration world, because they tended to freeze out Jews. A lot of them were also Hispanic. A lot of them were also people like Matt Baker, who were African American. So they all kind of knew, but they didn't make a big fuss of it because they didn't want any trouble. Matt Baker is one of the greatest comic artists of all time. So they see these insinuated themes of non-Caucasian, non-cis, non-conventional identity and influence. And to be honest with you, they see it better than I do. They really understand that. Sometimes they come up with things that say, this panel right here, is this what I think it is? And I'll look at it and I'll say, I've read this story 20 times and I've not noticed that. And you're exactly right. That's exactly what's going on here. So it's funny how these stories kind of magnetize their readers and pull us in. It's very exciting.
It's kind of like when we watched The Black Cat, and we're just like, for this, if it's time, its themes are crazy that they did this in this time. It's like looking at, pre-code horror, and like, it's crazy, these stories that they were telling back then.
Yeah. And never to a huge audience, because it's not for all tastes, right?
Sure, yeah.
And no one, I've never ever encountered an interview anywhere where someone said, "Oh yeah, we did this to screw up little kids. That was our goal." No, they were trying to tell great stories that had resonance. Most of them were just trying to make money, but the people who cared were trying to tell a great story using the medium in ways that had not previously been used according to the trends at the time. And there's so much in them. I'm still finding some of these stories I've read probably 40, 50, 100 times. I don't know. And I'm still finding new things in them constantly. And so are the students. So, yeah. And that's why they keep getting reprinted over and over and over again, because people still want to see them.
The comic code destroyed them or put a lot of these out of business. Like a lot of horror stuff, it's not going to stay dead. It will rise from the grave. It will come back out, and it will connect with an entirely new generation that shows them something that they've never seen before. And I think that's amazing.
Yeah, critics and cultural gatekeepers and elitists can poo-poo genre fiction like horror and western all they want, but horror never goes out of print, never goes out of style, right? So yeah. So if you don't mind, I want to read you this one thing because it fits with exactly what you're saying. This is a student response from one of my quizzes that I had, and the question, and this was the end of the class. The question I asked them was, ultimately, what can we as 21st century students of Gothic and strange art, and you individually, learn or gain from studying the rise and fall of the American pre-code horror comics? What benefits and concerns arise from these texts, their influence, reception, condemnation, and ultimate recovery as influential works of sequential art? And that's a pretty hefty question. And this is what one student wrote, and I think it's just brilliant. Pre-code horror comics is yet another lesson that art can be compromised by fear-mongering, misinformation, and censorship. The majority will always take comfort in tradition, and art will always be an easy target for scapegoating because it is so outwardly expressing itself and its content, because that's the point. Rather than address the root of why people might be enjoying these horror comics, such as the effects of the Second World War that scarred much of the nation, it's much easier to point the finger at a vampire because it's designed to be evil and scary. However, vampires, in many of Frederick Wortham's reports of juvenile crime, are completely fabricated. The truth is that horror comics serve little threat compared to the damage to the country after the war, and we should be careful, even in a modern era, of those who censor art. We can also learn that inspired works like EC Comics can inspire and inform readers of important topics. Many world-renowned artists were inspired by EC, such as Stephen King, Art Spiegelman, and many other comic artists who would go on to inspire more generations of artists and creators. Furthermore, EC stories such as Judgment Day and Master Race were many juvenile readers' first experience with the topic of the Holocaust and the idea that African Americans aren't any different from white Americans. These are important topics to teach to young, impressionable minds, and they discourage hate. Overall, the comics were doing more good than bad based on the concepts they were teaching to their readers, which only gave further reason for the U.S. government to censor them. The final lesson I learned from the horror comics industry during this time is that despite the government's best efforts, you can never silence art forever. Although sometimes strict guidelines can blossom new creativity among artists, which allows them to explore other avenues. While horror comics were banned for a while, it allowed room for other franchises to be born under the Comic Code Authority, such as Mad Magazine, a well-known franchise up to the modern day. Furthermore, EC-inspired horror comics would return once the Comics Code Authority fizzled out. So readers still ended up getting what they wanted, even if they had to wait.
Damn.
A+.
All right. Let's have that kid on.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Get this old guy out there. Get that kid on there. No, but so seeing that, I think really showed me that they get it as much as I do, and probably as much as we do. Right. That there are more lessons here about culture and censorship and taste and the value of the horrifying and the humorously horrific, and how those create lessons and moments of understanding that we don't get in any other kind of art form.
I do think, I mean, we've done that on plenty of these shows where we've talked about a subgenre that, like the Mexican Gothic ones, or even the Val Lewton stuff that we get feedback from fans going, I never bothered with that stuff, or I never heard of that stuff. And they're like, this is one of the best movies I've seen all year. And you're talking about a movie that came out 70, 80 years ago or longer. And I know for me, and I know Damien and Aaron feel the same way, when you hear that from a newer fan, that you just open this doorway and they're like, holy crap, did you notice this and this and this? It means that they're still effective, they still have value to it, and they're still important.
Yeah, no, it's true, and there's no wrong way to read it unless you just want to hate it because you want to hate it, right? So, yeah.
As I mentioned in the beginning, I am the young one here, and I learned a lot. So I know others are going to do the same and learn stuff. And it was cool to hear some of the stuff that I knew about, but then going, okay, didn't know that, but it is fascinating. And it is a wormhole I will not be going down. I definitely can't afford that stuff.
Yeah, no, there are a few who can, believe me. It's been astounding to see.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on, Dan.
I just want to thank you all for the invitation. It was wonderful to come on and talk horror geek with everyone. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for coming. I love horror comics. I've been a big fan forever, and I've always had a soft spot for the pre-code stuff for sure, even though I can't afford to buy any originals. So while pre-code horror only really existed for less than a 10-year period of time, its impact on the genre is monumental. Pick up any EC horror comic title and find the similarities to hundreds of movies inside its pages. And if you have never read any pre-code horror before, try something new. You might find a passion you didn't know you had, because reading horror comics is good for you.